By 1943, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. Germany's Atlantic coast was lined with the Atlantic Wall, a series of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and artillery emplacements were designed to make any Allied landing a nightmare. Hitler and his generals had placed their faith in these fortifications, believing that steel and stone could halt the tide of the American and British forces. They called it the impregnable barrier, yet cracks had begun to appear beneath the surface of this confidence. The German High Command had learned from past conflicts. After the defeat at Dunkirk in 1940, they understood the importance of static defenses. Coastal batteries were placed at strategic points overlooking beaches, and radar stations were installed to detect approaching aircraft. Engineers poured vast quantities of concrete into bunkers, creating reinforced structures that could withstand direct hits from medium-caliber artillery. Every kilometer of coastline was mapped, every dune surveyed, every approach fortified. Soldiers stationed along the wall felt a sense of security. They were part of a system designed to make invasion impossible. The doctrine was clear: hold the line at any cost, rely on fortifications, and the Allies would be broken before they could advance. But the reality of war had changed. The Americans and British had learned the lessons of early campaigns, developing air power, amphibious tactics, and specialized weaponry to overcome static defenses. Bombers were no longer simply tools of terror. They had become precision instruments capable of reshaping the battlefield. Strategic reconnaissance allowed Allied commanders to identify weak points in the Atlantic Wall, spots where concrete was thinner, artillery coverage was sparse, or the terrain favored assault. The Germans had underestimated one factor above all: the adaptability of the Allied forces. By mid-1943, the United States Army Air Forces had intensified bombing campaigns over occupied France, targeting ports, supply depots, and infrastructure. Heavy bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, carried loads exceeding 10 tons of explosives. Crews trained relentlessly in formation flying, timing, and precision targeting. Their goal was simple: dismantle Germany's industrial and defensive capacity before any ground troops set foot on European soil. Yet the Germans remained confident. Observers on cliffs and in bunkers reported bombers passing over with little effect. Concrete walls held. Artillery positions survived. It seemed the Atlantic Wall had fulfilled its promise. Meanwhile, German engineers continued to reinforce the defenses. Additional layers of barbed wire and mines were added to beaches. Anti-tank obstacles, known as Czech hedgehogs, were placed to prevent vehicles from moving inland. Bunker interiors were stocked with ammunition, food, and water, ready to withstand weeks of siege. Every decision was informed by calculations, maps, and manuals that left little to chance. Soldiers trained for every scenario, drills repeated daily, instilling confidence in both leadership and structure. Hitler personally inspected some of these fortifications, reinforcing the belief that the Allies could never penetrate this network of steel and concrete. Yet beneath this surface of invincibility, flaws existed. The fortifications, while impressive, were static. They could not respond to attacks from above or behind. Their guns had limited traverse, and overlapping fields of fire often left blind spots. Supply lines were vulnerable to sabotage and air raids. More importantly, the fortifications were designed to repel traditional assaults, not the combined arms and aerial bombardments the Allies were perfecting. German commanders, though meticulous, had not fully anticipated the scale and precision of American bombing capabilities. They relied heavily on assumptions that the Allies would attack at the most obvious points, that air superiority would be contested, that bombs could be dodged or absorbed by sheer mass of concrete. History, however, has a way of challenging assumptions. By late 1943, Allied planners began detailed studies of the Atlantic Wall's vulnerabilities. Photographic reconnaissance missions captured aerial images of coastal defenses, noting the layout of bunkers, the angles of artillery, and the density of obstacles. Intelligence officers compared images over time, identifying which positions were reinforced and which remained exposed. They noticed patterns. Some bunkers had thinner roofs, some artillery positions lacked proper camouflage, and certain beach sectors were less mined than others. This meticulous observation formed the backbone of a strategy that would soon exploit the weak points in Germany's formidable defenses. For the first time, confidence shifted. The wall, the symbol of German invulnerability, had weaknesses that could be targeted. Human factors also played a role. Morale among German troops varied. Many had been stationed in remote coastal positions for years, isolated from the front lines where battles raged elsewhere. Letters from home were scarce, and news of Allied successes reached them with delay. The monotony of guard duty bred complacency, even as officers drilled protocols for every conceivable scenario. Meanwhile, Allied propaganda highlighted German missteps, the inevitability of defeat, and the unstoppable power of American industry. Soldiers began to understand that the wall they trusted so deeply might not be the shield they imagined. Subtle cracks in confidence appeared, a psychological weakness that would soon compound the physical vulnerabilities. In essence, Germany's fortifications represented both engineering brilliance and strategic rigidity. They were a testament to meticulous planning, to the belief that the war could be waged through preparation and steel. Yet they were also a monument to hubris, an over-reliance on static defenses in an era defined by mobility, air power, and innovation. The stage was set. The Americans had identified the cracks, the Germans had invested in permanence, and the coming months would test whether the Atlantic Wall could truly withstand the modern art of war. It was not yet clear who would prevail, but the first signs of a decisive shift were already visible in the skies above France. These conditions created a tense prelude to the moment when the American bombers would find the weak point, exploiting the vulnerabilities that meticulous planning had overlooked. Every element, the technology, the human factor, the geography, was aligning toward a confrontation that would redefine the perception of what impregnable meant in modern warfare. From the human perspective, the soldiers manning the Atlantic Wall were caught between confidence and fear. Many were young conscripts, pulled from rural towns and factories, trained to believe in the invincibility of concrete and steel. They drilled daily, checked mines, adjusted artillery, and reinforced bunkers, yet the ever-present roar of Allied bombers overhead reminded them that no wall was truly safe. Letters from home often brought news of lost friends, feeding unease. Commanders encouraged strict discipline, emphasizing that the Allies could be beaten if every soldier held their post. But fatigue and isolation were relentless, eroding the human element of the defense. Each soldier's mind became a battlefield in itself, balancing pride in their engineering and training against the dread of an attack that might render both meaningless. Tactically, the Atlantic Wall was a marvel of defensive thought. German strategists had layered obstacles in depth. Beaches were littered with stakes, mines, and hedgehogs, slowing any amphibious assault. Artillery was positioned for crossfire, overlapping sectors to cover the coastline with a deadly mesh. Coastal roads were mined, and trenches cut into dunes provided infantry with firing positions while concealing their numbers. Every detail reflected lessons from past conflicts and calculations of Allied behavior. Yet this rigidity was also a flaw. The Americans did not plan frontal assaults in every case. They studied terrain, exploited gaps, and combined ground movements with coordinated airstrikes. Static defense could dictate the battlefield only if the attacker behaved predictably. Adaptability, rather than fortification alone, had become the currency of survival. Technological considerations revealed another critical angle. American air power had evolved beyond simple bombing raids. Precision targeting, guided by detailed reconnaissance, allowed bombers to identify and exploit the wall's weak points. B-17s and B-24s flew in tight formations, maximizing defensive fire while delivering concentrated payloads. Innovations such as delayed fuse bombs allowed explosives to penetrate concrete before detonating, undermining the very structures the Germans trusted. Electronic navigation systems and aerial photography gave planners unprecedented insight into enemy positions. Meanwhile, the Germans relied heavily on static observation posts and manual calculation, effective against traditional attacks, but insufficient against rapid coordinated air campaigns. Technology, in this case, had shifted the advantage from static defense to dynamic offense. Leadership decisions played a decisive role in shaping outcomes. Hitler's insistence on a rigid, unyielding defense limited the discretion of field commanders. Orders emphasized holding positions at all costs, even when intelligence suggested repositioning or reinforcement was necessary. Field officers, trained in tactical nuance, often found themselves constrained by directives that prioritized ideology over pragmatism. Conversely, Allied leaders demonstrated flexibility. They adjusted bombing targets based on real-time reconnaissance, altered flight paths to avoid concentrated flak, and coordinated with ground forces for synchronized attacks. Leadership, therefore, became a force multiplier, or, in the case of the Germans, a constraint that amplified vulnerabilities already present in the Atlantic Wall. The enemy perspective cannot be ignored. Allied planners understood the psychological weight of the wall. They knew German soldiers trusted in the impregnable label, and they exploited it. Bombing campaigns were not only physical attacks, but also instruments of demoralization. Reconnaissance photos, intercepted communications, and observation of German reactions helped the Allies anticipate weaknesses. By studying both the fortifications and the human element defending them, they could strike at the precise moment when confidence faltered. This dual focus on material and morale transformed the bombing campaigns into strategic operations rather than mere attacks, highlighting the interplay of intellect, technology, and human psychology in modern warfare. The moral dimension added another layer. Soldiers on both sides understood the immense human cost of breaching or defending the wall. Allied airmen faced flak, enemy fighters, and the ever-present risk of fuel shortages or mechanical failure. German defenders, often isolated and outnumbered in sectors, knew that a single breach could unravel entire defensive lines. Decisions were rarely abstract. Each had consequences measured in lives. The wall, while a symbol of engineering, became a stage for human courage, fear, and sacrifice. Every bunker stormed, every bomb dropped, carried weight beyond strategy, a reminder that war's calculus always included the human soul. These angles converge to show a dynamic tableau. The Atlantic Wall was not simply concrete and steel. It was an ecosystem of human, tactical, technological, and leadership factors. Success or failure depended on the interaction of these elements, each influencing the other. Soldiers' morale affected tactical decisions, leadership influenced technological deployment, and reconnaissance shaped both morale and leadership choices. By examining these perspectives, one sees that the upcoming confrontation would not be determined solely by firepower or fortifications, but by the nuanced interplay of forces on every level of warfare. The convergence of human endurance, tactical design, technological innovation, leadership rigidity, and psychological pressure set the stage for the moment when the wall would be tested like never before. The Americans had identified the weak points, the Germans had placed faith in permanence, and the ensuing clash would demonstrate which approach, static defense or adaptive offense, would prevail. This intricate setup, honed over months of planning and reconnaissance, led directly to the decisive moment when American bombers struck with precision, targeting vulnerabilities that had long been underestimated. The decisive moment arrived in the early hours of June 6, 1944, D-Day. Long before the first amphibious landing, the skies over Normandy were alive with the hum of aircraft, each bomber carrying not just explosives, but the culmination of months of intelligence, planning, and precision training. American B-17s and B-24s formed tight formations, engines roaring in unison as they approached the French coast. Below, the Atlantic wall stretched in concrete monotony, seemingly invulnerable, yet subtly flawed. Reconnaissance had revealed the weakness, the junctions between bunkers, areas of thinner concrete, and positions where artillery coverage left gaps. These were the points the Allies would strike first, turning the wall's greatest strength into its most exposed liability. At precisely 05:30, the first bombs fell. Delayed fuse explosives penetrated reinforced bunkers, detonating after impact to maximize structural collapse. The walls, once symbols of German confidence, shattered under the calculated assault. Dust and smoke erupted from concrete casements as artillery positions crumbled, leaving German gunners exposed. The meticulous layering of defenses, so carefully constructed over years, could not absorb the focused, high-explosive precision of American air power. In many sectors, bunkers that were thought to be impervious were reduced to rubble within minutes. Soldiers stationed inside scrambled for cover, some trapped by collapsing ceilings, others rendered disoriented by the deafening explosions. Simultaneously, Allied tactical coordination ensured that no section of the coastline was left unthreatened. While bombers focused on fortifications, fighter aircraft strafed roads and rail lines, disrupting reinforcements and supply chains. Artillery emplacements attempting to fire back were targeted by follow-up strikes, neutralizing resistance systematically. The Americans had not simply attacked, they had choreographed destruction. Each sortie was calculated, timed, and synchronized with ground movements to maximize the effect on both material and morale. The Atlantic Wall, once considered impenetrable, was collapsing under the weight of innovation, speed, and precision. German leadership was caught in an impossible dilemma. Field commanders, witnessing the destruction of bunkers and artillery nests, recognized the urgency but were constrained by standing orders. Hitler's insistence on holding positions at all costs prevented timely withdrawal or redeployment. Communications were disrupted by bombing and sabotage, leaving many units isolated and uncoordinated. Panic rippled through command posts as the theoretical defenses crumbled into reality. Even experienced officers, trained to anticipate attacks, found themselves reacting to situations they had never envisioned. The wall's static rigidity, once an advantage, became a trap. By the end of the morning, entire sectors had been rendered ineffective, the backbone of German coastal defense shattered. From the human perspective, the scene was chaotic and terrifying. Young soldiers, many barely 20, faced the horrifying combination of collapsing structures, deafening explosions, and the relentless advance of Allied troops across the beaches. The psychological shock of seeing fortifications fail, walls they had trusted their lives to, undermined cohesion and morale. Many attempted to man their positions, returning fire in disjointed bursts, but the combination of aerial bombardment and advancing infantry left little room for effective resistance. Confusion spread as soldiers attempted to regroup, often moving into areas already compromised by bomb strikes. The wall that had promised safety now felt like a tomb for those who relied on it. At the same time, American troops on the ground observed the effects of the air campaign with grim determination. Engineers moved quickly to clear obstacles, medics treated the wounded, and infantry pressed forward across beaches previously considered impassable. The destruction of bunkers and artillery positions reduced incoming fire, allowing for a more effective advance. Every fallen obstacle represented not just a tactical advantage, but a psychological victory. Soldiers understood that the wall's collapse was not only structural, it signaled the unraveling of German confidence along the entire front. The turning point was unmistakable. By mid-morning, the Americans had exploited the wall's weak points, penetrating sectors once considered secure. Bomb craters and shattered concrete formed new pathways for advancing troops. German defenses, designed for resilience, were systematically neutralized by precision, coordination, and adaptability. The wall's failure highlighted the limitations of static fortifications in modern warfare. No matter how thick the concrete, no matter how overlapping the fields of fire, an adversary that combined intelligence, technology, and flexibility could find and exploit vulnerabilities. The Atlantic Wall, the embodiment of German defensive strategy, had met its reckoning. In essence, the climax was not simply a moment of destruction. It was the culmination of strategy, intelligence, human courage, and technological innovation converging on a single, decisive point. The Americans had found the weak link, exploited it with precision, and demonstrated that even the most formidable fortifications could be overcome when every element of warfare, air, land, leadership, and morale worked in concert. The Atlantic Wall was breached, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that Germany had relied upon for years. The collapse of these defenses did not just allow Allied troops to land, it reshaped the battle for Normandy and, more broadly, the European theater. What had seemed impregnable now lay in ruins, opening pathways that would ultimately lead to the liberation of France. Yet the story did not end on the beaches. The consequences of this breakthrough rippled through strategy, command, and the psychology of both armies, setting the stage for the brutal aftermath of the campaign. The breach of the Atlantic Wall had immediate and far-reaching consequences. By the end of June 6, 1944, American and Allied forces had established footholds across several Normandy beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, once considered impregnable, were now contested zones. German resistance, though still fierce in pockets, had been destabilized. Bunkers lay in rubble, artillery positions silenced, and supply routes disrupted. The wall had failed not only as a physical barrier, but as a psychological anchor. Soldiers who had trusted its permanence were now forced into desperate improvisation under constant bombardment and infantry assault. Casualties were high on both sides. Allied forces suffered thousands of dead and wounded on the beaches, but the air campaign's precision had reduced exposure to concentrated fire. German losses were compounded not just by bombs and bullets, but by collapsing fortifications that trapped or injured defenders. The psychological toll was devastating. Units once confident in their positions were scattered, communication lines severed, and command structures overwhelmed. The Atlantic Wall, A project that had consumed millions of man-hours and vast quantities of concrete and steel had proven vulnerable to a well-coordinated modern assault. Strategically, the failure forced immediate adaptation. German commanders scrambled to reinforce inland positions, attempting to slow the Allied advance through hedgerows, villages, and forests. Mobile reserves were redeployed where possible, but the rigidity of high command limited flexibility. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat or localized counterattacks exacerbated losses. Meanwhile, Allied planners capitalized on the breach, moving tanks, artillery, and engineers rapidly to expand their beachheads. Ports, such as Cherbourg, became critical objectives to sustain the momentum, and logistical chains were established behind the front lines to ensure a continuous flow of men and material. The wall's collapse had not only opened the coast, but shifted the initiative irrevocably into Allied hands. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Propaganda across Germany had long touted the Atlantic Wall as invincible. News of its breach, carried in whispers and intercepted reports, undermined morale among troops stationed along other sectors of the European coastline. Confidence in static defenses eroded, creating hesitation, distrust of command, and fear of subsequent assaults. Allied forces, conversely, gained momentum and conviction. The success demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and coordination could overcome even the most formidable fortifications. The breach became both a tactical and symbolic victory. Reports from the field reinforced the significance of the moment. General Omar Bradley noted the extraordinary courage of our troops and the effective use of air power to neutralize defenses. German accounts, recorded post-war, reflected surprise and frustration, acknowledging that the wall, which we believed impregnable, was penetrated in ways we had not anticipated. These testimonies confirmed what historians would later emphasize. The combination of aerial bombardment, tactical precision, and exploitation of human and structural weaknesses had transformed the Normandy landings from a calculated gamble into a decisive breakthrough. The collapse of the Atlantic Wall also influenced subsequent Allied operations. Lessons learned in reconnaissance, target selection, and coordination were applied in campaigns across France, the Low Countries, and ultimately into Germany itself. The efficacy of integrated air and ground tactics reshaped military doctrine, underscoring that static fortifications, no matter how extensive, were vulnerable to dynamic, technologically informed offensives. Germany's reliance on permanence, reinforced by ideology and meticulous engineering, had failed against an opponent that understood the modern battlefield as a multidimensional environment. By the close of the first week of June 1944, the wall's rubble-strewn beaches had become a testament to both human ingenuity and hubris. Fortifications that had symbolized strength now symbolized the limits of static defense, while the Americans' ability to identify and exploit weak points set the stage for the liberation of Western Europe. The aftermath of this breach rippled far beyond Normandy, affecting strategy, morale, and the very understanding of modern warfare. The fall of the Atlantic Wall stands as a profound lesson in the evolution of warfare. Concrete and steel, no matter how meticulously planned or reinforced, cannot compensate for rigidity in strategy or inflexibility in thought. The wall represented human ingenuity and ambition, yet it also revealed the dangers of overconfidence. The Germans had invested in permanence, in structures meant to withstand any attack, but the Allies demonstrated that adaptability, intelligence, and precision could dismantle even the most formidable defenses. Beyond the physical destruction, the breach highlighted the human dimension of war. Soldiers on both sides faced fear, uncertainty, and moral weight as they confronted forces and obstacles far greater than themselves. Courage was tested not only in offense or defense, but in endurance, decision-making, and the capacity to act under relentless pressure. The moment when bombs shattered concrete bunkers and pathways opened across the beaches encapsulates the intersection of human effort, technology, and strategy, a convergence that defines modern conflict. The Atlantic Wall's failure also reshaped military thinking. Static fortifications, once central to defense doctrines, were shown to be insufficient in an era dominated by mobility, air power, and coordinated intelligence. The breach underscored the importance of innovation, reconnaissance, and psychological insight in planning operations. Victory was no longer guaranteed by mass or material alone. It depended on understanding weaknesses, exploiting them, and acting decisively. Ultimately, the story of the Atlantic Wall is a reminder that war is a contest of adaptation, courage, and intellect as much as of resources. The wall, built to be unbreakable, fell not through brute force alone, but through the careful, relentless application of knowledge and ingenuity. In its rubble lies both a warning and a testament. Even the greatest fortifications cannot resist the combination of human resolve, technological mastery, and the unyielding pursuit of opportunity.